Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're here to take complex sources, boil them down, and give you the essential knowledge.
And today, we're really embarking on quite a critical journey.
Yeah.
It starts not just with, what's on your plate, but the entire system that puts it there.
Exactly. We're diving deep into what you might call the industrial maze of our modern food system.
Yeah, our mission today is to trace this feeling of, well, abundance and maybe confusion too, right back to its roots. And those roots, they're often found in heavily subsidized monocultures. Think corn, think soy.
And maybe the best place to start thinking about this, well, it's the modern supermarket, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely, a perfect example.
I mean, you walk in there and it's designed to be overwhelming. You stand in pretty much any aisle and you're hit with this incredible, almost staggering illusion of choice.
Rows and rows of seemingly different things.
Right. And we all ask ourselves, okay, what should I actually eat? It's a constant question. But here's the thing. Based on the sources we looked at, if you're genuinely confused about nutrition, the real answer, it probably isn't even in that supermarket aisle.
No, it's usually far outside it.
Yeah.
You have to look at the fields, the processing plants, the factories, things you, the consumer, generally never get to see.
And, that confusion isn't entirely accidental. Some might say it's even deliberate. It really defines our current era.
Michael Pollan actually calls it an age of total dietary confusion. And that's really what we want to unpack today. How did this dominant model, this industrial food production system, so reliant on government money pouring into corn and soy, how did it become the foundation for, well, almost everything we eat?
It brings up this really fascinating contradiction, doesn't it? Let's call it the American paradox.
Okay, yeah. Explain that.
Well, think about it. The more we seem to worry about nutrition, right? The more labels we read, the more health studies we follow.
We obsess over it sometimes.
Exactly. And yet, collectively, as a population, we seem to be getting less healthy. How does that work? Why is this paradox so persistent?
It's sticky, like you said, because I think we're focusing our attention on the wrong things. The paradox exists because a lot of what people in America eat today, it isn't really food in the way our grandparents might have recognized it.
Not whole food.
Not whole food, no. It's often, to borrow a phrase from the sources, edible food-like substances.
It's quite a term.
It is, but it fits.
Yeah.
These are highly refined, hyper-processed products that come out of intense food science labs and industrial engineering processes.
And then they're packaged up, often with big health claims plastered right on the front.
Right, which honestly should probably be your first clue that maybe it's not inherently healthy or whole if it needs a label shouting about its health benefits.
You're consuming the marketing, the information, not necessarily the nutrition itself. You see the label fortified with vitamin X, and you kind of skim over the other 15 often unpronounceable ingredients.
Precisely. And to really get a handle on how this industrial machine took over our plates, we need to realize something important. This drive for cheap, really dense calories to fuel economic growth, it's not new.
Not at all. You can trace it back quite a way.
Absolutely. If you look at the history of industrialization itself, the need for cheap, efficient energy for the workforce was, well, paramount.
Like fuel for the human machine.
Kind of, yeah. The sources we looked at suggest that things like sugar and potatoes, providing huge amounts of cheap, reliable calories, they were just as crucial to the Industrial Revolution as, say, coal or the steam engine.
Because they fed the factory workers cheaply.
They provided that essential, low-cost fuel needed for people to work incredibly long hours in those factories.
And we can even see the seeds of this industrial thinking earlier, can't we? If you look at, for instance, the sugar plantations in the West Indies.
Oh, that's a stark example.
Yeah.
Those weren't just farms. Their production model, which was terrifyingly efficient in its own way.
And utterly dependent on slave labor.
Completely. That model is arguably one of the earliest prototypes of a true large-scale industrial process, focused entirely on maximizing volume, maximizing profit through these intense, frankly dehumanizing inputs.
So that historical mindset, this focus on scale, on sheer output, often regardless of the human or environmental cost, that's the philosophical ancestor in a way.
It absolutely sets the stage. It's the lineage for the industrial approach that dominates the corn and soy system we see today.
Okay, so let's try and unpack this engine then. If the main output is cheap calories, we need to follow those calories. So part one. Let's call it the cheap input engine corn and soy monoculture.
Sounds right.
This whole system, it seems to run purely on efficiency and scale, taking these incredibly cheap, government-supported commodities,
corn and soy,
and turning them into the basic building blocks for animal feed, for sweeteners like high fructose corn syrup, and even, increasingly, for fuel like ethanol.
And it's crucial to understand that efficiency, it doesn't just happen naturally in a free market. It relies heavily, fundamentally, on massive, ongoing government intervention.
Subsidies.
Always the subsidies.
Yeah. Soy is actually a perfect historical case study for how government action can really cement a commodity's dominance.
Think back to World War II.
Okay.
The U.S. government was, understandably, really concerned about making sure there was enough food and agricultural output for the Allied forces overseas.
They needed reliable supply chain.
Exactly. And their solution was pretty straightforward. Throw money at it. A huge financial incentive. In 1942, the government started paying farmers $1.60 per bushel for soy.
Which was?
That was basically double the pre-war price. Overnight.
Wow. So that just flooded the market with an incentive to grow soy.
Instantly. This massive injection of capital just exploded soy production.
Yeah.
It locked soy right into the center of the agricultural economy because there was now this reliable, guaranteed floor price backed by the government.
Okay, so once you have that kind of scale, that level of production and reliance on a single crop, you need big players to handle it all, right? The logistics, the processing.
You absolutely do. And this is where we have to talk about companies like Archer Daniels Midland ADM.
The supermarket to the world, as they sometimes say.
Right. ADM is the world's largest processor of both soybeans and corn. They take the raw stuff, the commodity, straight from the field.
And they transform it.
Transform it into, high fructose corn syrup, soy protein isolates, animal feed ingredients.
Yeah.
All the downstream products.
But their power doesn't just stop at processing the raw materials, does it? This is where that concept of vertical integration really becomes key to understanding how dominant they are.
That's a critical point. ADM doesn't just process the inputs. They're also major shareholders in some of the biggest meatpacking companies.
Ah, okay, so they control more than one link in the chain.
Exactly. This integration means ADM effectively has significant influence, if not outright control, over both ends of the supply chain. They process the raw material, the corn and soy.
Which becomes animal feed.
And then they also have a major stake in the companies that are buying that feed to raise the animals.
So the whole system is kind of designed to feed itself, ensuring a massive, stable market for those cheap commodity inputs they process. It benefits the big processor, maybe not so much the farmer.
Well, precisely. And this industrial logic, which is incredibly efficient for a giant corporation like ADM, it creates what many see as a real economic trap for the individual farmer.
How so?
It relentlessly pushes them towards extreme specialization. Just grow corn or just grow soy. Monoculture farming. And this creates a cycle that agricultural critics often describe using the language of addiction.
Addiction, like dependency.
Dependency engineered by design. You see it very clearly with specialized seeds and the chemicals that go with them. Think about what's sometimes called the Monsanto model, though Monsanto is now owned by Bayer.
Okay, the seed company model.
Right. They sell genetically modified seeds, probably the most famous being Roundup Ready soybeans. These seeds are specifically engineered to survive, being sprayed with Monsanto's, now Bayer's, own herbicide, Roundup.
Okay, so the seed and the chemical are designed to work together.
As a package deal. So instead of a farmer buying, generic seed here and maybe generic weed killer there, they get locked into this proprietary technology bundle.
They have to buy both.
They commit to buying the specialized seed and the matching pesticide, often year after year after year. If they decide to switch seeds, maybe try something different next year.
Then their investment in the whole Roundup system, the sprayer technology, maybe leftover chemicals, it's potentially wasted. It makes switching costly and difficult.
It's an economic lock-in. But the trap isn't just economic, it's also, you could say, philosophical. It's reinforced by this really deep-seated mindset about soil fertility itself. What's often called the NPK paradigm.
NPK, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, the big three macronutrients for plants.
Exactly. Now, what's fascinating here is that the NPK paradigm, it sounds very scientific, right? Nutrients, chemistry.
Yeah, seems logical. Plants need these things.
They do.
Yeah.
But the paradigm itself can be conceptually limiting. It's the belief, often pushed for decades, that soil fertility comes primarily, maybe even only, from adding external manufactured chemical additives, N, P, and K.
As opposed to
seeing the soil as a living system.
Yeah.
Farmers, often supported by decades of advertising from chemical companies and, frankly, training in many agricultural schools, are encouraged to view soil not as this complex, vibrant ecosystem teeming with life.
But more like an inert medium, a sponge.
Yeah, almost like a mechanical blob or a pot that just needs to be topped up with these three key chemicals. Some critics have even sort of wryly labeled farmers who rely solely on this approach as nozzle heads,
Because they're just spraying everything from a nozzle.
relying entirely on artificial fertilizers and herbicides delivered through spray nozzles. The real conceptual harm here, though, is that this trained reliance, this NPK-focused worldview, it makes them ignore or discount alternative methods.
Methods that might be cheaper or better for the soil in the long run.
Often, yes. Things like regenerative agriculture practices. For example, planting multi-species cover crops. You might plant red clover alongside your oats.
Why do that?
Well, it does multiple things. It can improve soil fertility naturally by fixing nitrogen. It protects the soil from erosion. And it can physically suppress weeds, reducing the need for herbicides.
But that doesn't fit the neat chemical-dependent model.
Exactly. It's more complex, maybe requires different management. So because it doesn't fit that sort of mechanized NPK spray everything worldview, it often gets dismissed, even if the long-term benefits for soil health, biodiversity, and reduced chemical costs could be substantial.
Okay, so this system demands these cheap, uniform inputs, corn and soy, grown with this NPK mindset. And that leads us right back to the supermarket experience.
It does. It feeds directly into it.
Which brings us to part 2, the illusion of choice and the rise of nutritionism. You walk into a big grocery store, and as we said, the shelves are just overflowing. Thousands of different packages, different brands. It looks like incredible abundance.
It really does. Thousands of distinct SKUs, as they call them in the industry.
But you're saying that apparent bounty, it's mostly surface level.
It's largely diversity in name only. When you actually start reading the ingredient lists on the back of those thousands of different boxes and bags, what do you find?
Corn derivatives? Soy derivatives?
Overwhelmingly, yes. Most of those products are, at their core, genetically uniform derivatives of corn and soybeans. They're just dressed up in different packaging, maybe different artificial colors, different marketing slogans.
The sheer number of boxes hides a fundamental lack of actual variety in what we're eating.
A radical and potentially dangerous lack of true biological and nutritional variety in the standard Western diet.
And the job of the food scientist then becomes taking these incredibly cheap, uniform, and often, let's face it, nutritionally quite empty inputs.
Yeah, refined starches, sugars, oils.
And making them taste good, making them appealing, maybe even addictive. They have to essentially manufacture the flavor, the texture, the whole sensory experience.
Oh, absolutely. They literally manufacture appeal. There's a fascinating anecdote that really lays this bare, involving Rice Krispies Treat cereal.
Okay, I think I know the one, the marshmallow issue.
That's it. The manufacturers, they wanted to replicate that classic gooey marshmallow texture from the square treat, right? But they ran into a problem. They couldn't figure out how to engineer the cereal bits so that they stayed crunchy and delivered that gooiness once you added milk.
The milk made it soggy, or the goo wasn't right.
Exactly. The technology just wasn't cooperating. So what did they do? Did they abandon the product concept?
No, they went to the consumer. Right. Focus groups.
They did. They went to focus groups, laid out the dilemma, and essentially the focus groups gave the manufacturers permission, you could say, to ditch the actual physical gooey texture.
As long as
the cereal still delivered the flavor of gooey marshmallow.
Wow. So the simulation was enough.
The simulation was acceptable. This is such a profound insight into industrial food development and marketing. Consumers, it turns out, are often willing to trade the actual physical reality of a food experience, like real gooiness, for a simulated sensory one, like just the flavor, especially if it comes with convenience or a lower price.
So the food gets engineered to hit those specific sensory buttons: salt, sugar, fat, the so-called bliss point.
Precisely. Hit the bliss point, deliver the expected flavor profile, often completely divorced from the actual nutritional substance or lack thereof.
And this whole engineering approach is perfectly complemented by this ideology really, called nutritionism, which, as it turns out, is incredibly convenient for processed food companies.
It's extremely convenient. Nutritionism, as a way of thinking about food, defines foods primarily, maybe even only, in terms of their isolated, measurable nutrient quantities.
Like grams of protein, milligrams of vitamin C, micrograms of folic acid.
Exactly. It pulls your attention away from the food itself, its wholeness, its history, how it was grown, its synergistic effects, and focuses entirely on these quantifiable, often decontextualized metrics.
And the advantage for the manufacturers seems obvious.
Totally clear. If food is mainly understood through its isolated nutrient parts, then processed foods, which start as these cheap, often nutrient-poor commodity inputs, can be improved. They can be fortified with specific vitamins or minerals.
Slap it on the label.
Slap it on the label, and then successfully market these products as being healthier than, or at least equivalent to, whole, unprocessed foods. They can claim superior nutrition if they just add the right amount of a few key, often mandated or trendy nutrients.
Kellogg's was really a master of this, weren't they? With cereal fortification.
A classic example. They started fortifying cereals with things like folic acid, vitamin B6, vitamin B12, and then they used what are called structure function claims in their marketing.
Like help support a healthy heart.
Exactly, language like that. Suggesting that eating their cereal promoted a healthy cardiovascular system because it contained these added B vitamins. They're essentially using the language and authority of biomedical science to sell what is, fundamentally, a highly refined, often sugar-laden, edible food-like substance.
So while they're tinkering with nutrients at the micro level, adding things in, these same large food companies are often working at the macro level too, lobbying the government.
Oh, absolutely. Lobbying to make sure that official dietary guidelines, the advice that comes from government agencies, remains deliberately, well, ambiguous.
Vague.
Vague is a good word. Instead of getting concrete, maybe uncomfortable advice like eat fewer processed snack foods or avoid sugary drinks.
Advice that might actually hurt sales of certain products.
Right. Instead, we get these broad, non-specific principles that are carefully designed not to alienate any particular food product or category. Think about phrases like, seek balance, variety, and moderation.
Sounds reasonable on the surface.
It sounds reasonable, but it's effectively meaningless in practice. This kind of guidance successfully promotes the underlying idea that, quote, there is no such thing as a good or a bad food.
Which is very convenient if you sell processed food.
Extremely convenient. It encourages the consumption of all foods, including the highly processed fortified ones, thereby safeguarding the entire market for industrialized food products. No category gets singled out.
Okay, so we followed the cheap crops, seen how they get processed into these food-like substances, and how they're marketed with this veneer of health through nutritionism. Now we really have to confront the darker side of this whole equation.
Yeah, this is where the hidden costs, the externalized costs, start to become really stark and, frankly, disturbing.
Let's call this part 3, the true cost of scale. And a huge part of that cost relates to where a lot of that cheap corn and soy ends up feeding livestock.
That's right. Those cheap grain inputs, they need a massive, guaranteed market, a hyper-efficient destination. And largely, that destination is the CAPFO.
The concentrated animal feeding operation, the factory farm.
The factory farm model, exactly. Raising huge numbers of animals, packed tightly together, often indoors, on diets primarily composed of this unnatural, grain-based feed, mostly corn and soy. The entire system is engineered purely for speed, volume, and converting cheap grain into meat as fast as possible.
And this relentless drive for speed and efficiency, it comes at a cost, a staggering cost, often, in terms of animal suffering. A cost the industrial system has largely managed to externalize, to keep hidden from view.
It's deeply troubling when you look closely. Take the broiler chicken, for instance, the standard chicken most of us eat.
Okay.
Through intensive genetic selection, these birds have been bred to grow incredibly fast. About 3 times faster than chickens raised back in the 1950s.
3 times faster. That seems unnatural.
It is. And that speed of growth fundamentally outpaces their natural skeletal and organ development. Their bodies just can't keep up with the rate at which they're accumulating muscle mass.
And the consequences for the birds.
They can be horrific. Studies cited in the sources indicate that something like 90% of broiler chickens have detectable leg problems by the time they reach slaughter weight. Just a few weeks old.
90%.
90%. And a very significant portion, around 26%, or more than a quarter, are suffering from chronic pain directly because of bone diseases caused by this rapid growth. They often don't move around much in the barns, not just because it's crowded, but because simply standing up and walking causes them intense, constant pain in their underdeveloped joints.
Yeah, it's hard to hear. And it's not just chickens, is it?
No. The suffering extends to other animals, including highly intelligent animals like pigs, in the intensely confined, stressful conditions of a typical CAFO.
Metal crates, concrete floors.
Often, yes. Many pigs show clear signs of severe psychological distress. Things like compulsively chewing on the metal bars of their cages, obsessively pressing water dispenser bottles even when they're not thirsty, exhibiting behaviors that look like mourning. Some animal scientists have even diagnosed pigs in these conditions with learned helplessness.
Like they've just given up.
Essentially, yes. A kind of depression induced by the environment.
And for the young animals, the piglets, the system seems almost designed to be brutal right from the start.
It is, often by necessity of the system itself. Piglets in these industrial settings are frequently born with physical deformities, things like cleft palates, hernias, sometimes even being born without an anus, which obviously requires intervention.
And even the healthy ones face procedures.
Yes. In their first few weeks, they typically endure a whole barrage of painful procedures that are essentially surgical. Their tails are often cut off, their sharp needle teeth are clipped, and the males are castrated.
And this is done without pain relief?
Almost always, yes.
Yeah.
No anesthetic, no pain relief afterwards.
But why? Why do these things? It sounds cruel.
It sounds cruel, and it is painful, but from the system's perspective, it's about efficiency and managing the consequences of confinement. Tail docking, for example, is done to prevent other stressed, bored pigs from biting tails in the crowded pens, which can lead to infection. Teeth clipping is done to prevent damage to the sow's udder during nursing and injuries when piglets fight for teats. Castration is done mainly to prevent boar taint in the meat.
So these procedures are basically responses to the problems created by the crowded, stressful factory conditions themselves.
Precisely. The system creates the pathology, the stress, the competition, the aggression, and the solution is these painful mutilations performed without anesthetic, because providing adequate space, enrichment, or individual care would simply be too expensive and cut into the efficiency model.
Okay, moving from the animal suffering, what about the environmental costs? Concentrating so many animals must create a huge waste problem.
An absolutely enormous waste problem. The sheer volume of manure and urine produced by these facilities is staggering, and dealing with it is a massive challenge.
Where does it all go?
Often it's stored in massive open-air pits called lagoons or sprayed onto nearby fields as fertilizer. But the volume often exceeds what the land can safely absorb.
Or it runs off.
It runs off or leaches into groundwater. We can see really specific regional impacts. Look at the Delmarva Peninsula, that area covering parts of Delaware, Maryland, and Virginia. It's a huge hub for poultry production.
Right.
The sheer amount of poultry waste generated there is identified as the primary source of water pollution in the region. It results in high levels of nitrates contaminating about 1/3 of all the groundwater in the agricultural areas there.
Nitrates in drinking water, that's a direct public health risk.
Absolutely, especially for infants. And the risk of catastrophic spills from those waste lagoons is immense. The scale is hard to comprehend. I mean, we have to mention the notorious Smithfield food spill.
What happened there?
They had a lagoon breach, I believe it was in North Carolina, and spilled over 20 million gallons of raw hog waste into a river.
20 million gallons.
20 million gallons. Just try to picture that volume. To put it in perspective, that amount of toxic liquid waste is comparable to or even greater than some of the really major industrial chemical spills or oil spills we hear about, like the Exxon Valdez.
But this was agricultural waste, which maybe doesn't get the same level of regulatory scrutiny.
Often the regulations are different, sometimes less stringent. It's not just, localized mud or manure. It's a systemic environmental disaster waiting to happen. This waste, laden with nitrogen, phosphorus, often antibiotics and pathogens, gets pumped into these lagoons. They leak, they breach, especially during heavy rains or hurricanes.
And then it flows into rivers?
Flows into rivers, estuaries, coastal waters, causing massive algal blooms that suck oxygen out of the water, creating huge dead zones where fish and other aquatic life just can't survive. It's widespread ecosystem destruction directly linked to concentrating animal production.
And beyond the immediate pollution, these factory farms, these CAFOs, they pose bigger systemic risks too, don't they? Thinking about global public health.
Yes, absolutely. Especially concerning things like foodborne illness outbreaks and, critically, the development of antimicrobial resistance.
How does that link work?
Well, when you have huge numbers of animals, often genetically very similar, packed tightly together under stressful conditions, it's just the perfect breeding ground for diseases to emerge, mutate, and spread like wildfire.
And antibiotics are used heavily.
Historically, yes. Often used not just to treat sick animals, but prophylactically to prevent disease outbreaks in those crowded conditions, and sometimes even just to promote slightly faster growth. This widespread use of antibiotics creates selective pressure, favoring the survival and spread of antibiotic-resistant bacteria.
Which can then potentially transfer to humans through the food chain or environmental contamination.
Exactly. It's a major global health threat. And consider the scale of expansion happening right now. Since the 1980s, the poultry industries in countries like India and China have been growing at explosive rates between 5 and 13% annually.
That's huge, sustained growth.
It's staggering. If those two countries alone were to reach the same per capita poultry consumption as Americans currently have, which is around 27 or 28 birds per person per year, just India and China together would be consuming as many chickens as the entire world does today.
The mind boggles. And that density.
That explosive, highly concentrated growth dramatically increases the number of interfaces between these densely packed animal populations and the human food supply chain, which in turn significantly elevates the risk of zoonotic diseases jumping from animals to humans and potentially triggering pandemics. The CAF model doesn't just produce cheap meat, it actively produces systemic global health risk.
So all of this, the subsidies driving the corn and soy, the food engineering, the animal suffering, the environmental pollution, the health risks, it all seems to rely on one crucial thing.
What's that?
Deliberate ignorance on the part of the consumer. We have to be, in a way, purposefully unaware of where our food really comes from and what the true ethical, social, and environmental implications of that low price tag actually are.
That feels right. There's a necessary disconnect.
So let's pull back that curtain in part 4. The hidden human and ecological cost.
Okay. The challenge, as you said, is tracing almost any common food item back to its actual origins without bumping into these hidden costs, especially the human cost. Take something seemingly simple, like fresh tomatoes you buy at the supermarket year-round.
Okay, tomatoes.
Despite decades of research trying to automate everything, most fresh market tomatoes still have to be picked individually, by hand. It's incredibly demanding, back-breaking labor.
And the people who do this work.
The labor force, often migrant workers, faces extreme structural vulnerability. And that vulnerability is actually a key component in keeping the price of those tomatoes low. Think about agricultural hubs like Immokalee, Florida, a major center for tomato picking.
What's the situation there?
Many workers there don't have their own cars. They have to live within walking distance of the specific downtown pickup spots where the crew leaders bring buses early each morning to take them to the fields.
So their housing options are really limited geographically.
Extremely limited. This necessity, the need for labor to be concentrated right there, easily accessible for the buses, it creates incredibly high demand and thus high rents for what is often really substandard housing. Shared, dilapidated trailers, for example.
So they're captive, in a sense, forced to accept poor conditions at high prices because their mobility is constrained by the logistics of the agricultural labor system.
It's a form of structural exploitation built into the commodity system. And the human cost goes beyond just housing. The exposure to pesticides in these fields can be devastating.
There's a specific story mentioned in the sources, isn't there?
Yes, a truly tragic one. The story of a farm worker named Francisca Herrera. While she was pregnant and working in the tomato fields for a company called AgMart, she was exposed to pesticides being sprayed.
And her child.
Her child was born with catastrophic birth defects, no arms and no legs.
Oh my God.
And when an investigator later visited the family to understand their living situation, he found this young couple and their severely disabled child sharing a shabby, cramped, 2-bedroom trailer with 7 other migrant workers.
9 people in a 2-bedroom trailer.
9 people. That profound vulnerability, that level of exploitation, having to accept those working conditions, that exposure to toxins, that crowded housing, that is part of what structurally subsidizes the cheap price of that perfect-looking, fresh, year-round tomato you pick up in the supermarket without a second thought. That low price is being paid by someone else, somewhere else in immense suffering.
It's a heavy realization. Now, if we shift from the direct human exploitation to the ecological foundation of this system, the soil itself, we see that these industrial methods, they lead directly to really profound soil degradation.
Yes, long-term biodiversity loss and ultimately environmental instability.
And a key indicator of this damage is the loss of something crucial in the soil, carbon.
Organic carbon, yes. It's the very foundation of healthy, fertile soil. If you compare, say, the soil in a healthy, undisturbed forest, it might have an organic carbon content of maybe 2 or 3%, sometimes more.
Okay. What about typical farmland?
Well, when you look at conventional agricultural plots that have been subjected to decades of industrial practices, heavy mechanical tillage, continuous monocropping, intensive chemical inputs, the difference can be shocking.
How much carbon is left?
One study from Ohio State, mentioned in the sources, compared forest soil to nearby conventional farm plots. Those conventionally farmed plots had only about 0.5% carbon left in them.
So a loss of maybe 75–80% of the soil carbon?
or more. That carbon, which is the lifeblood of the soil, providing structure, water retention, and food for microbes, it's literally been oxidized, burned off into the atmosphere as CO2 through these practices, directly contributing to climate change and leaving behind soil that's becoming less fertile, less resilient, essentially a lifeless medium propped up by chemicals.
And it's not just the carbon. These conventional practices, they actively harm the living part of the soil, too.
Absolutely. Things like heavy tillage plowing, rototilling, and the use of certain sterilizing chemicals or fumigants, they just decimate the beneficial soil biology. And often, the most fragile but also the most essential components, like certain types of fungi, are the first to go.
You mentioned fungi earlier, mycorrhizal fungi.
Yes, exactly. Mycorrhizal fungi are incredibly important and incredibly delicate. These are beneficial fungi that form symbiotic relationships with the roots of probably 95% of all plant species on Earth.
What do they do for the plants?
They act like microscopic extensions of the plant's own root system. They form this vast network in the soil, reaching out much further than the roots can alone, and they're incredibly efficient at unlocking and absorbing vital nutrients like phosphorus and water, delivering them back to the plant in exchange for sugars the plant produces through photosynthesis.
So they're like a natural fertilizer and irrigation system built into the soil.
A living biological one, yes.
Yeah.
But when conventional tillage rips through the soil or sterilization techniques are used, these delicate fungal networks are shattered. The soil food web is broken.
And the consequence for the farmer?
The farmer loses this incredibly valuable, free, natural infrastructure that helps feed and water their crops, which forces them back into relying even more heavily on external, manufactured NPK chemicals to push nutrients into the plants. It just reinforces that cycle of dependency, that NPK paradigm we talked about earlier.
And finally, stepping back to the bigger picture, this entire industrial food system, it seems like it's been built on the gradual systemic disappearance of something core to American identity for a long time, the traditional family farm.
That's a really important point. Small and medium-sized family farms, diversified farms, they once formed the backbone of much of the U.S. economy and culture. They created local wealth, supported rural communities, fostered economic diversity.
But the industrial model favors consolidation, bigger and bigger operations.
Exactly. And the loss of all those smaller farms, the consolidation into just a few massive players, it doesn't just change the social fabric of rural areas, it creates critical vulnerabilities in the food system itself due to that centralization.
We saw that fragility exposed pretty clearly recently, didn't we?
Oh, absolutely. During the supply chain disruptions caused by the COVID-19 pandemic,
Yeah.
remember when just a handful of massive centralized meatpacking plants had to shut down due to outbreaks among workers?
Yeah, suddenly there were shortages on supermarket shelves, even while farmers were having to euthanize animals they couldn't sell.
Precisely. The entire system seized up, revealing just how fragile it had become. It starkly demonstrated the risks of relying so heavily on this highly concentrated, hyper-efficient, but ultimately brittle industrial model.
Okay, so if the current industrial system is causing all these problems, externalized costs, animal welfare issues, environmental damage, social disruption, systemic fragility, what does a path towards something better look like? How do we start to change things?
That's the crucial question, isn't it?
Let's dedicate part 5 to exploring that. Seeds of change and rethinking our relationship with food.
Okay, well, the first, maybe uncomfortable thing to acknowledge is that small-scale sustainable farmers generally cannot and probably should not even try to compete directly with massive corporate agriculture purely on the basis of price per pound.
The economies of scale are just too different.
Completely different. Instead, many successful alternative models focus on working with nature, not against it. They often involve systems that are higher in skilled labor and knowledge, but lower in capital investment for chemicals and heavy machinery.
Like what kind of systems?
Things like holistic planned grazing, where livestock are moved frequently to mimic natural herd movements, regenerating pasture land instead of degrading it, or using those multi-species cover crops we mentioned to build soil health naturally. Daily mob grazing is another technique focused on intense, short-duration grazing followed by long rest periods for the pasture.
So mimicking natural ecosystems rather than imposing an industrial template.
That's exactly. Trying to build ecological resilience and fertility from within the system. But even when these farmers produce amazing, high-quality, ecologically sound products, they often run into major roadblocks when they try to sell them into the existing market.
Because the market infrastructure is built for the industrial scale.
Yes. The logistics, the expectations, they're all geared towards uniformity and volume. Imagine a small farmer who raises, say, a whole cow, really ethically, on pasture. They might approach a local restaurant.
Okay.
But the restaurant, especially if it's part of a chain, might only want one specific cut, say, just the tenderloins, or just the ground beef because that's what fits their standardized menu. They don't want the whole animal, they want uniform inputs, just like the industrial system provides.
So the small farmer is left trying to market all the other parts of the animal, which takes time and effort.
Exactly. And then there's this sheer administrative burden, the paperwork.
Oh, yeah. Regulations, certifications.
It can be overwhelming. Asking a small family farm, maybe it's just 2 people running the whole operation, to navigate incredibly complex USDA regulations, develop HACCP plans, hazard analysis critical control point plans, deal with mountains of certification paperwork, just to sell a few dozen eggs or 1 pig to a local store or institution.
It's a huge barrier to entry.
It's often prohibitively complex and expensive. It acts as a form of friction, intentionally or not, that preserves the dominance of the large-scale players who could afford entire departments just to handle compliance and paperwork.
So changing the system requires changes not just on the farm, but also in the marketplace and maybe in us, the consumers.
Absolutely. The consumer role is critical.
Yeah.
And part of that role is becoming much more aware, much more critical of how industrial producers often try to borrow or co-opt the language and credibility of truly sustainable agriculture for marketing purposes.
You mean misleading labels?
Misleading labels are a huge part of it. We see the emergence of what you could call faux natural systems. You, as a consumer, need to be really vigilant about this kind of marketing greenwashing.
Can you get an example?
Sure. Take the label free-range chicken. Sounds great, right? Pictures of chickens roaming in grassy fields.
Yeah, that's the image.
But legally, under USDA definitions, that label can often be applied to chickens raised inside massive confinement houses, shoulder to shoulder. As long as there's one small door that opens onto maybe a tiny patch of bare dirt or gravel outside, which only a fraction of the birds might ever actually access.
So access to the outdoors doesn't mean they're actually ranging freely?
Not necessarily at all. And then there are labels that sound official, but mean even less, like the term USDA natural.
What does natural mean on a meat label?
Legally. Almost nothing significant about how the animal was raised. It generally just means the meat contains no artificial ingredients and was minimally processed after slaughter. It says absolutely nothing about whether the animal lived in a CAFO, ate GMO corn, received antibiotics, or anything about its welfare or the environmental impact of its production.
Wow. So these terms that sound good, they look like or sound like ethical farming.
They allow the industrial giants to capitalize on the positive associations consumers have with real sustainable farming, confusing people and making it harder for the farmers actually doing the hard work to differentiate themselves and get a fair price. It reinforces the status quo.
It seems like fighting against this requires almost an active refusal.
That's a powerful way to put it. And historically, movements towards food self-reliance, towards creating alternative food systems, have often been exactly that. Acts of refusal against the failures or injustices of the mainstream system.
Can you think of examples?
Sure. Think about the Black Panther Party in the 1960s and 70s. They organized survival programs, including free breakfast for children programs, explicitly to combat hunger and the effects of structural racism and economic inequality within their communities. It was a direct response to the failures of the existing system to provide basic needs.
And maybe more recently.
See echoes of it today in the rise of urban agriculture, community gardens, especially in food deserts or public housing complexes, people taking control of a small piece of land, growing food for themselves and their neighbors.
These aren't just hobbies then, they're political acts.
They can be seen as profound acts of refusal, yes. Pushing back against systemic inequalities, building local resilience, fostering community connections, and offering fresh possibilities outside the confines of the industrial food chain.
So the ultimate goal here, it's not just about swapping one product for another on the shelf. It's deeper than that.
Much deeper. It's about trying to escape these unhealthy cycles, as the sources put it. The short-term attraction of cheapness and convenience that the industrial system offers.
Which leads to
the long-term addiction or dependency on those specific products, those specific ways of farming, the chemicals required, the whole NPK mindset. Escaping that requires a fundamental reset, a conscious rethinking of our entire relationship with food and where it comes from.
So this deep dive today, we've really tried to trace the path from those heavily subsidized fields of corn and soy,
Right through the processing plants, the feedlots.
exposing those vast externalized costs, the burden placed on animals, on vulnerable workers, on the environment itself, that low price we see at the checkout counter.
It's really just a reflection of all the true costs that we collectively choose not to see or are encouraged not to see.
And if we connect this whole journey back to just basic culinary preference, you can see how the industrial system has really pushed one particular style of eating meat.
Yeah, it favors what you might call the urban style of meat consumption. People generally wanting meat that is very tender, very mild in flavor, usually coming from very young animals raised quickly, as opposed to a more traditional, perhaps rural style, which might involve eating older animals, animals that perhaps were used for work, like dairy cows or laying hens, which often have a stronger, more complex, more developed flavor profile. The industrial system is incredibly efficient at producing that bland, tender, quickly grown meat that fits the urban preference.
And that preference for mildness, for tenderness above all else, it kind of sets the stage for the next frontier in food tech, doesn't it? Lab-grown meat.
Cultivated meat, yeah. It's fascinating to watch the development, huge amounts of venture capital, intense technological effort, all aimed at creating a food product in a lab that, as goal is often stated, looks like a hamburger and maybe tastes a little bit like a hamburger.
But what's the underlying goal there? What are they really trying to replicate?
Well, that's the provocative question, isn't it? Based on the focus, the technology seems primarily aimed at imitating the result of the industrial system, a relatively mild flavor, a consistent texture, and crucially, a low cost that can eventually scale up to compete with or replace industrially produced meat.
So, if the main goal of this advanced technology is simply to mimic the outcome of the current industrial model, the blandness, the efficiency, the low cost, rather than trying to somehow replicate or restore the ethical or ecological origin of good food.
Is that really a pathway out of the industrial maze we've been discussing?
Or is lab-grown meat potentially just a new kind of factory? A technologically sophisticated way to keep us hooked on cheap, mild calories, ensuring we remain locked in that same industrial paradigm just without the farm animals.
That's definitely something to chew on as you think about the future of your own plate.
Indeed.
Hmm.
A lot to consider there.
We look forward to diving deeper with you again next time.
Thanks for joining us for the deep dive.